Hey guys, today I want to talk about fixing your DJI Spark footage. But before we get into that, I want to share a few quick tips to help you get it right the first time. So whenever I'm shooting video with my SLR or video with my Spark, I'm really careful with my settings. I'm using manual exposure and I'm using manual white balance because I don't want my exposure or my color to fluctuate. And getting it right in the camera will save you just a ton of work on the back end. So let's just go over a few quick tips to help you get it right the first time. Setting manual exposure is all about getting a consistent result. If you use auto, your exposure is just going to constantly fluctuate, and that's just a nightmare to fix in post. So even if you're not comfortable using manual exposure, at the very least, while using auto, just double tap the center of the screen to lock the exposure so it doesn't fluctuate. Same goes for manual white balance. If you leave it on auto, color will constantly fluctuate, and that's a real challenge to fix in post. Now, setting manual white balance is super simple. You're gonna be flying most times during the day, so if it's cloudy, set it to cloudy. If it's sunny, set it to sunny. At the very least, you're gonna get consistent color that's much easier to adjust in post. And lastly, you always wanna make slow, controlled movements with your remote. And if you're having trouble doing that, switch over to tripod mode. That dampens out the controls and makes it much easier to get that buttery smooth movement. Also, if you're flying way up in the sky, you can kind of let it rip and fly as fast as you want, and it doesn't make too much of a difference. But if you're closer to the ground or closer to objects, you really want to slow down, because otherwise you just end up with a blurry mess and it's really difficult to watch. Finally, same goes for the gimbal. If you're going to be making those tilty gimbal movements, you want to slow down the speed of your gimbal. So just go into settings and bring that way down to like 5 or 10, and so you can get those really nice movements. Okay, so I've loaded up a bunch of clips into a Final Cut Pro 10 project, so we can dive in there and take a look at solving some of those common problems that you may encounter with your DJI Spark footage. I will also mention that I use a 24p timeline, and the only reason I do that is so I can take my 30p Spark footage, slow it down by 20% for just a bit of extra smoothness, you know, for those days when your piloting skills aren't quite up to snuff. So let's jump into Final Cut Pro and start solving some of those problems. Okay, this first example, I've assembled some related clips. They were all shot during the winter. They were shot on different days and different times. And even though I was using manual exposure and manual white balance, they have different color casts and different exposure. So when you're putting together a sequence of clips, you don't want major shifts in color or exposure. It just doesn't look good. So what we need to do here is get the shots looking more consistent from clip to clip. Before I start in on that, I'm just going to change my workspace. I'm going to turn off my browser by hitting Control-Command-1 because we don't need that. And then I'm going to turn on video scopes by hitting Command-7. So when using video scopes, I'm pretty much always using waveform and RGB parade. So that gives a nice breakdown of our color and also shows us our exposure as well. So when I skim through the footage, you can see in the video scopes the shifting color and shifting exposure. So let's start by fixing our first clip here. Okay, so I'm just going to hit Command 6 here, bring up a default color correction. I have it set to color wheels, but I'm going to switch it to color board. Just one thing to note here, I'm using Final Cut Pro 10.4.6. If you're using a version older than 10.4, you're not going to see as many color correction options. So with this clip, I don't think there's too much to do here. Maybe just brighten it up a touch and maybe just try to get rid of that, you know, sort of dominant blue color cast. So on my color board, I'm just gonna push up the master exposure, maybe take that up to, well, 12 looks pretty good. So switch over to color here and I'm just gonna select my master and I'm just gonna pull down the blue just a touch. Red needs to come up a bit, so I'm going to select red highlights and I'm just going to pull up the red there just to try and balance that out. I'm going to go back to exposure and just add a touch more contrast by pulling my shadows down. And I'm going to push up my highlights just a touch more just to really brighten up that snow. Okay, so moving on to the next clip, you can see this one it's you know, it's really blue. So yes, I was using manual white balance, but clearly I had my white balance set wrong. So I'd also say this one is probably, maybe a little bit underexposed as well. That's pretty easy to fix. So we have our color corrections already up. I'm going to go with color board here. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just kind of push up the exposure. I'm going to bring it up quite a bit. Well, maybe we'll try 15 to start. So now we have this really dominant blue cast. So I'm going to go over to color, and I'm really going to bring up the reds here a bunch to try and even that out. So somewhere in there, it doesn't look too bad. And I'm going to just bring down the blue in the highlights just a touch. So now it's kind of like, it's looking good, but I think it's sort of lacking a bit of contrast. So I'm going to add a color curve here and pull down the shadows a bit for some contrast. And then I'm going to push up the highlights just a touch more to get really nice, bright looking snow. So that looks pretty good compared to our other one. Maybe it's still a touch too blue in the highlights. So on our color curves, I can just bring that down just a touch, and then I'll push up the red highlights a touch too. So that doesn't look too bad. Now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to undo all these changes here. So I'm going to get rid of my color board and my color curve. So we're back to our ugly blue, and show you a couple more ways to do this. If we click on our little magic wand here, we can select balance color, and that's automatically going to fix the color for us. I think that almost did a better job, although it looks a little bit yellow. If you didn't like how it did the job, you can go over here, choose manual white balance, and then you have your eyedropper, and you just need to select a pure white portion of the image to do the color correction. So I'm going to turn that off, and then one final way we can correct this is we can say match color. And all we need to do is just skim along until we find something we want to match it with, click on it, say apply match, and look at that. So it's balanced the color out for us. Now the cool thing here is we have another clip that looks exactly the same way, terrible white balance, really too blue. So we can come over to the one we just adjusted, hit Command C, go over to the clip we want to paste it to, hit Command Shift V, and what we're going to do, we're just going to use the match color on this one. Paste that on, and yeah, there you go. That looks pretty darn good with minimal effort. So moving on to the next clip, this one here, it doesn't look too bad. Maybe it's a touch bright, could use a bit of contrast, and maybe we need to balance that color out a little bit. Hit Command 6, I'm going to go for my color board here. And first thing I'm going to do is just pull down the exposure a touch. Maybe bring the shadows down a bit for a bit more contrast, and I'm just going to push up the highlights to keep our snow nice and bright. Now when we compare it to the other clips, maybe this one is a bit sort of yellowy red. So what I'm going to do is just push up the blue in the highlights. Now I can just do it from here, go into my color panel, choose my highlights, and then just bring the blue up just a touch. So now we have this last clip here, and this one looks, to me, it just looks a little bit too yellow, and it's also a bit dull. We're going to choose our color board once again. And first thing I'm going to do is bring up the exposure. So I'm going to bring it up a whole bunch here, really brighten it up. So 15, that looks pretty good. But now we've kind of killed all our contrast. So pull down the shadows a bit to add some of that contrast back. And then this image, when we compare it to the other ones, it's looking way too yellow. So what we want to do is bring up our blue. And we can just choose master here and just come up a little bit in the blue. Maybe a touch more, just boost our highlights a bit to bring the snow a little bit more in line with the other clips. This next group of clips all have consistent color and exposure, but they don't really have much contrast and probably could use a bit more pop. So let's just switch our video scopes over to histogram view here for a second. And you can see with this one clip that most of our pixels are concentrated in the midtones, but we have this one spike over on the right-hand side, and that is our sky. Now, I shot this footage on a dark and cloudy day, so I increased my exposure so that my subject was well lit, but that meant that the sky got blown out. So even if we take this clip and we add a correction here and we pull our exposure way down, you're still not going to get any detail back out of that sky. So keep that in mind when setting your exposure. There is only so much dynamic range, so there will be scenarios like this one where you need to choose how to expose your shot. Okay, so let's make some adjustments. First thing I'll do though is get rid of this color board with Option Command X to remove the effect. I'm going to switch my video scope back over to waveform, and then we can take a look at this first clip here. I think what I'm going to do with this one is add a color curve, and the first adjustment would be just to add some contrast. So I'm just going to slide my black point over here a bunch, and I'll put one more point here in the middle just to make sure that my midtones aren't being crushed. Moving on to color, it looks like we have a bit too much red in the highlights, so I'm going to bring that down a touch. And then I'm going to just bring up the blue in the highlights a bit. That looks pretty decent, but we need a bunch of saturation to give this some pop. So added a color board, and I'm just going to push the saturation up to about 30. So that looks much better than it did. Now, these three clips are all consistent color and exposure, so I'm just going to hit Command C on this first clip, select these next two clips, and hit Shift Command V to paste the same effects. So there you go. That was pretty quick and easy, but like I said, we had consistent color and we had consistent exposure, so that makes it much easier to adjust. Okay, so last example. We've got this nice looking waterfall footage, but the color just looks really wonky. Now, it was shot using manual exposure and manual white balance, so I've got really good consistency. But on this particular day, the sky was just filled with smoke from nearby forest fires, and everything had this really eerie looking kind of orange-red cast to it. I also find too that the spark's kind of drifting a little bit here, so this footage could probably benefit from being slowed down to give it a bit more stability. So let's just go to our first clip here. I'm going to hit Command R to bring up the retime editor. I'm going to choose custom, and I'm going to slow this footage down to 80% of normal speed. Now, and that's exactly what I talked about at the very beginning, and that's why I choose a 24p timeline, so I can slow my footage down by 20%. For these next two clips, I'm going to do the same thing, just a different way. I'm going to go up to my retiming editor and choose automatic speed, and you can see it does the exact same thing. So I'll select all of these, hit Command R to turn that off, and then we can start making our corrections. So if you look at our video scopes here, you can see, yeah, it's just definitely, we need some more blue in this image because red and green are dominant. So I'm going to go up to my correction here and choose my master and start dragging it over into the blue. And you can see right away, the color is much more even and much more natural looking. As I showed you in one other example, there's more than one way to accomplish that. We could also go up to our little magic wand there and choose balance color. And you can see that it's pretty much done the same adjustment that I did. So I'll turn that off. And we'll go back to our original clip here and we'll just make a few more adjustments. So bring up our color correction, and this time I'm going to choose a color curve, and I'm just going to add a little bit more contrast. So push up the highlights, bring down the shadows, maybe not quite that much. And finally, I'm going to go to a color board and just boost the saturation to about 10%. I think that's looking pretty good. Now all these clips are shot at the same time, same day, so I can just take these adjustments, hit Command C, select my other two clips, hit Shift Command V, and paste those same effects. And let's take a look here. And yeah, I think that's looking much better. Well, that's it for this one, guys. I hope you learned a trick or two to fix up some of those common problems that you may encounter with your DJI Spark footage. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And yeah, you guessed it, I will see you in the next one.